My name is Julie Comparini. I'm a concert and opera singer, and in my free time, I knit. As far as singing goes, I was always mostly interested in early music, so my musical education is in the context of historically informed performance. And that means I'm used to working with primary sources, historical musical manuscripts, sometimes in earlier systems of notation, and also learning about cultural history through the lens of historical practice. How do people do whatever it was they did at any point in time? What were their tools, their resources, the social and economic structures that shaped their work? And if we're talking about an artistic discipline like music, how can we use that knowledge to inform our interpretations of these works in the modern day? At the same time, I've been knitting since I was a teenager, and about 5 or 6 years ago, I started getting interested in vintage fashion, vintage knitwear, and I started collecting vintage knitting magazines, mostly from the 1950s to the 1970s, particularly one called Stitchcraft. Stitchcraft was a British monthly handcraft magazine, not just knitting, also embroidery, tapestry, crochet, but mostly knitting. And it was active from the 1930s to the 1980s. I don't know why I latched onto Stitchcraft particularly, but at some point I had collected the entire 1960s, 120 issues from January 1960 to December 1969. And I started a long-term project where I made one object from each of those issues in order. I started a blog to write about it called the Stitchcraft 60s, and I wrote every month. I write one post about that month's issue and one post about whatever it was I made from that issue. And the more I worked from these historical patterns, the more similarities I started noticing between historical music performance practice and historical, so to speak, knitting practice. For example, just like when in early music, the earlier you go, the less information is encoded in the knitting pattern. Now, a modern knitting pattern has usually a lot of detailed information for multiple sizes, very explicit instructions, ideas for customizations, charts, schematics, measurements. If it's a digital pattern, it might be 10 pages long or more. A mid-century pattern, for example, here's a magazine from 1949 where they managed to put 3 entire instructions for 3 projects on one page. That's very typical of the time. And if you go back even earlier, there's even less information. The pattern may only be written for one size, or it may not have any measurements, or it may not tell you what thickness of wool to use. Maybe they'll just name a brand of wool that hasn't existed for 80 years, so you need to find out what kind of wool that was. What kind of needles? The numbering system for needles has changed greatly over the years, especially in non-metric countries. So you might not have the right kind of information to even know how big is this thing going to be that I'm knitting? Am I using the right yarn and the right needles to get the right size if there are no measurements in it? Or they may have very helpful schematics and patterns, but they may put the schematic for your knitting pattern on the same page as all the sewing patterns in the same issue, and it may look like this. And you have to find your pattern in all of this and know which one it is. And of course, knitters of that time had the context, were living in the context, and they had the knowledge that they needed to work from that, just like a harpsichordist in the 17th century knew how to realize a figured bass and knew how to improvise in the right hand and could make an interpretation of a work without all the information that we don't have now, or that we have to do some research to find out if we want to play a figured bass in our modern time. Similarly, I've learned a lot about cultural history of the mid-20th century from early knitting patterns. I always say, if I ever go back to school and get a doctorate, I'm going to write my dissertation on tampon advertisements in mid-century knitting magazines. Sounds very funny, and it is, but it's also very illuminating. For example, here's an issue of Stitchcraft from 1952, and it has an advertisement for Tampax tampons. We see an illustration of a happy woman at a fancy dress ball, and the headline is "Confidence and Poise. The completely modern, completely different way of sanitary protection. Fashion-wise, women can plan their engagements months ahead in happy certainty that no inconvenience or embarrassment will mar their poise." Or this one, for example, also Stitchcraft, 1958. "You're one step ahead of the crowd. You're always the first in your crowd to try new things. Lets you go where you want to go in perfect comfort and freedom, invisible and unfelt, no chafing, no odor, no disposal problems." So they're saying tampons will make you free and independent, and you'll have no trouble in your life, and everything will be nice and easy and happy. In the British knitting magazine. For contrast, here's a German knitting magazine from the same time, 1952. Bayer's Handarbeit und Wäsche. And there's also a tampon advertisement in it, where we see an illustration of happy, smiling men. And the headline is, "Die Männer lieben einen ausgeglichenen Charakter. Deswegen benutzen längst all jene Frauen, die es sich nicht leisten können, einige Tage im Monat nicht in Form zu sein, den neuzeitlichen Amiran Monatstampon." Translation: men like an easygoing personality, so if you're one of those women who can't afford to not be in their best form a few days a month, you need to use tampons, otherwise men might not like you. Well, that says a lot about cultural differences in the 1950s, doesn't it? All joking aside, although that's not really joking, I find that by going through this process of working from original sources, be it a musical source or a knitting source, be it from the 15th, 17th, 12th century or the 1960s, by going through this process, we understand the material better. And then we're able to make better decisions about how we want to interpret this material in the performance or in the object we're making in our time. How authentic do I want my recreation, which is of course a new creation of this early music piece or this early knitting pattern to be? Well, that's my decision, and there's no right or wrong answer to that, luckily. But if we have the tools to make those decisions, if we understand what people of the time had for tools, for resources, if we understand how they worked with this material, then we can make more interesting decisions about this material now. And I think that's, in the end, that's what keeps art alive, and that's what keeps our art looking towards the future.